High in the mountains of Peru, 92 people stood on a cemetery hill, and from up there, they watched an entire town of 18,000 people vanish. Not burn, not flood, vanish. In about 3 minutes, the town of Yungay was gone, buried under millions of tons of rock and ice and mud. Homes, churches, a whole stadium, thousands of people, all of it swallowed by the mountain. And here is the part that should make you angry. This was not a surprise. 8 years earlier, 2 scientists looked at that mountain and said, "It is going to collapse. It is going to bury this town." And instead of listening, the people in charge told them to shut up. They threatened them with jail. So the warning was buried too, years before the town was. This is the story of how a mountain became a weapon and how 92 people lived to tell us about it. But before we climb that mountain, 3 questions. Why was almost the entire town sitting indoors, glued to their TVs and radios at the exact moment the earth started shaking? How did 300 children survive? Because of a clown? And why were the only 2 people who saw this coming forced to run for their lives? Stay with me, because every answer here is darker than the last. It was a Sunday, May 31st, 1970, around 3:23 in the afternoon. And Peru was watching football. The World Cup had just kicked off down in Mexico, and all across the country, families had crowded inside their homes, gathered around televisions and radios, following every minute of it. In the valley town of Yungay, life looked perfect. Picture it, a beautiful little town of about 25,000 people, green fields, a grand stone cathedral, palm trees in the main square, and towering over everything, the white, snow-covered peak of Mount Huascarán, the tallest mountain in all of Peru. For generations, that mountain was just home. The thing you woke up to, the thing that watched over the town. The people of Yungay had no idea they were living at the bottom of a loaded gun. Here is what nobody in that town could see. High up on the north peak of Huascaran, the rock was sick. This wasn't a solid, healthy stone. It was old granite, cracked and broken into pieces by millions of years of pressure and ice. And sitting on top of it, a giant cap of glacier ice, about 30 meters thick. That's like a 10-story building made of ice, balanced on broken rock, on a slope so steep it was almost a cliff. And it had already failed once. Back in 1962, a chunk of that same peak broke off and killed around 4,000 people in nearby villages. That collapse didn't fix the problem. It made it worse. It stripped away support and left the rest of the slab hanging there, weaker than ever. Think of it like a cracked windshield. One more bump and the whole thing shatters. So the mountain just waited, quiet, patient, for years. It only needed one thing, one good push. That push came from under the ocean. 35 kilometers off the coast, deep under the Pacific, the earth ripped open. A magnitude 7.9 earthquake, 45 seconds of violent shaking that flattened cities across the region. And up on Huascaran, the loaded gun finally went off. A massive slab of rock and ice, about 800 meters wide, tore loose from the peak. Witnesses said it sounded like a gunshot, like an explosion. It dropped, 600 meters straight down. And when that much rock and ice slams into a mountainside, it doesn't just slide, it shatters into a churning wave. Mud, boulders, ice, water, all mixed together. And then it did something almost impossible. It started to fly. Moving at over 200 miles an hour, the wave trapped a cushion of air underneath itself. It was so fast it practically floated, sliding on that air with almost no friction. Nothing on Earth could outrun it. In the town, people thought the worst was over. The shaking had stopped. They were climbing out of the rubble. They had about 90 seconds. There was a ridge between the mountain and Yungay, a natural wall 200 meters high. The people believed it would protect them. It always had. But the wave was moving so fast, it jumped the ridge, leapt right over the top of it and came down on the town. First came the wind, a violent blast of air that threw people to the ground before they even saw it. Then came the wall, 60 meters of grey mud. And in about 3 minutes, Yungay was gone, buried under 5 meters of debris. An estimated 18,000 people, silenced. A man named Mateo Casaverde was there. He was near the cemetery when the noise started, a deep, terrible roar coming from the mountain. He looked up and saw a giant cloud of dust, and then the wave itself. He ran, up the cemetery hill, as high as his legs could carry him. Later, he described what he saw. He said the sky went dark. He looked around, and Yungay and its many thousands of people had simply disappeared. The mud stopped just 5 meters below his feet. He was one of the 92 people who survived only because they happened to be standing on that one small hill, which, by the way, was an ancient burial mound built thousands of years before. An old place for the dead became the only safe place for the living. And then there are the children. On the edge of town, a small circus had set up. Around 300 kids were there for the show. When the earthquake hit, a clown kept his head. He led the children, like a Pied Piper, away from the tent and up toward higher ground, up to the stadium. Minutes later, the mud arrived, but those 300 children were already safe. A clown saved an entire generation of that town. Now, here's the part that turns this tragedy into something worse. Remember I told you this was predicted? Back in 1962, 2 American scientists named David Bernays and Charles Sawyer were on an expedition on Huascaran, and they saw it. That huge, cracked slab of rock being slowly pushed apart by the glacier. They did the responsible thing. They warned people. They said this slab could break loose and destroy Yungay and the towns around it. And how did the authorities respond? They called the warning outlandish, hurried, uninformed. They forced a newspaper to print a retraction, and then they threatened the scientists with arrest. The charge? Disturbing the public tranquility. In other words, don't scare people, don't be bad for business. So the 2 men who tried to save 18,000 lives were forced to flee the country. 8 years later, the mountain proved them right, exactly the way they said it would. When the dust settled, almost nothing of Yungay was left. Just 4 palm trees still standing in what used to be the main square, and a white statue of Christ, arms stretched wide on top of the cemetery hill, looking down at a grey wasteland where a town used to be. The destruction was so complete and the bodies buried so deep, in some places up to 80 meters down, that digging them out was impossible. So the government made a decision. They declared the entire site a national cemetery, Campo Santo, holy ground. No digging, no building. The thousands who died are still there, right where they fell. Today, every year, on May 31st, all of Peru stops. Schools run earthquake drills. They call it the Day of Natural Disaster Reflection, a whole country remembering so it never forgets. If stories like this grip you, the silent failures, the warnings nobody listened to, I did a video on the Helios 522 ghost flight where a tiny mistake left a plane full of people doomed for hours. I'll link it at the end. But here's the thought I can't shake. That mountain, Huascaran, it's still there, and the rock on that north peak is still cracked, still broken, still sitting in that same dangerous balance it was in back in 1970. The loaded gun was never unloaded. And here's the truly chilling part. Today, around 9,500 people have moved back and built their homes right in the path where that wave would travel again. They know the history, they know the risk, and they stay anyway. Because that's the thing about the forces that hold up our world. The ground, the mountains, the quiet, beautiful things we trust. Sometimes, the very thing that watches over you is the thing that's waiting to bury you. I'm going to keep digging into these stories, the ones the world chose to forget. So if you want to come with me, subscribe and stay curious.